right, I'd like to call to order the Planning Commission meeting of Thursday, February 16th. If we can start with roll call.
Chair Dennison.
Here.
Vice Chair Hutt.
Here.
Commissioners Pevsner. Simcock.
Here.
And you.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you. Look for a motion to approve the agenda.
I move to approve the agenda for the meeting tonight.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Motion carries unanimously. Approval of minutes from the February 2nd meeting.
I don't have any comments.
I don't have any.
With that, I'll move approval of the minutes of the February 2nd meeting.
I'll second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Motion carries unanimously. Our council member, I don't think she dialed in. No. So we will not have a council liaison report today. So with that, we will move to community input. At this time, any person may address the Planning Commission concerning an item that is not on tonight's agenda. The Commission welcomes your attendance and participation. When addressing the Commission, please begin by providing your name and address for the record. Please keep comments to no more than 3 minutes. Anyone here to speak on an item not on tonight's agenda? Hearing none, we will move on to a presentation from Mr. City Attorney on the California legislative session updates.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to get the presentation up on the screen here for you. So there's going to be a 3-part presentation because I didn't want to take up too much of your time during this meeting. The first 2 parts are going to cover new bills that are now laws related to planning, and the third one is going to cover things that are related to the Planning Commission, like the Brown Act, potentially Public Records Act, and conflict of interest laws. So in the 2022 legislative session begins, I think it begins in December of 2021, and it goes all the way till October, November of 2022. There were 2,020 bills that were introduced. 997 bills were signed into law by the governor. 169 were vetoed. Many of the bills, if not, I'd say something like half of them, died in committee. But that doesn't mean much because a lot of those bills that die in committee are reintroduced the following year. So this first one isn't actually law yet, but I thought it was interesting. I wanted to address it because it could have big effects for housing in California. So the Senate approved Constitutional Amendment 2. So on the 2024 state ballot, there's going to be a measure to repeal Article 34 of the California Constitution. Article 34 was approved by California voters in 1950. It was passed in response to the Federal Fair Housing Act of 1949, which was part of President Truman's Fair Deal to help lower income post-war families move into better living situations. This constitutional provision prohibits low-income rental housing development without a majority vote in an election. So what that means is the state or local government cannot itself undertake nor assist in financing of low-income rental housing. And low-income rental housing has to be, I think, 50% or more low-income rental. So this specifically targets has nothing to do with building housing per se. You could build market rate housing that the state could build market rate housing. It can contribute funds for others to build market rate housing. You just can't build low-income housing.
Did the current law that was passed in 1950 apply to redevelopment agencies?
It did apply to redevelopment agencies, and the workaround that people found is they would use, in order to get funding, I actually don't know about redevelopment agencies, but currently the way affordable housing is built is they use some kind of workaround with federal tax credits, so they don't get direct financing. So anyway, this is a big, I don't know exactly how they did redevelopment financing for low-income housing. Maybe they didn't have at full low income, or maybe it was something less than 50%. I'm not sure.
It'd be a contribution, generally like 25% of the agency's revenue goes to the housing department that will produce the housing.
Mm. I wasn't practicing when redevelopment was around.
I'm just wondering if one of the reasons why this wasn't attacked was because redevelopment was a workaround, and then now that redevelopment agencies are gone, there's no good workaround.
Well, it was attacked. It was attacked when it was adopted. There have been constitutional, it's been on the ballot a couple times for repeal, and it got struck down every time. The legislator thinks now is the time that they're going to get it through because there's such a pressure on housing. In fact, on that point, opponents tried to challenge it on equal protection grounds, but as you probably know, being poor isn't a protected class. So all the government had to prove, or the proponents had to prove, is that there's a rational basis for having this requirement for referending low-income housing and no other type of housing. And the court said, you know, the voters have a right to referend, and it's protected in the Constitution, and we find that it's not discriminatory in intent. Now, in actuality, if you look at some of the things happening in the 1950s with integration, it definitely is a racial component that I won't be getting into now, but it's there.
Shocking. In 1950.
So another reason why the state wants to get rid of it is because there's a lot of federal financing for low-income development, and California can't take advantage of it because of this law. So if this is actually repealed in 2024, you might see, I hate to use the term projects, but you might see housing projects that are being pursued by the state in the future.
Is there a special threshold for a constitutional repeal?
This is going to be a majority vote.
Just a majority?
It's going to be
of
simple
voters.
majority, yeah. The ADU ones I really won't get into because I know you've talked about it at your prior meeting. It's the ones that Planner Wolf has already mentioned in his staff report. SB 897 increases height maximums, requires objective standards for historic properties, accommodates pre-existing non-conforming ADUs, regulates demolition permits, prohibits fire sprinklers where not required for the primary dwelling. AB, it should say 221, sorry. 221 allows detached ADUs to include detached garages and prohibits front setback standards. All this you've already discussed, and it's going to come back again for this commission's review at a later date. Density bonuses. So there wasn't actually a lot of amendment. I don't think there was any amendment to the residential density bonus. However, the legislator did reenact an expired provision, which is the commercial development bonus. So the residential density bonus is 65915.5. This one is 65915.7. Like I said, it existed, it expired, and now that we've reintroduced it, it also has a sunset provision in 2028, so it's also set to expire. To qualify, a commercial developer must directly build affordable units, donate land for affordable housing, or make cash payments to an affordable housing developer. If they do that, right, so if now they're trying to get commercial developers to get in on the build lower income housing game. If they do that, they can get certain bonuses on their commercial development, right? So for example, 20% increase in max intensity under the general plan, 20% increase in max allowable floor area ratio, 20% increase in max height requirements, and other variances from the zoning ordinance and land use regulations. The problem, as pointed out by the Legislative Analyst's Office, is that in the prior iteration of this, the one that expired, according to HCD, only 5 units were actually built under this law. So no one seems to be using it, and this new law that was reenacted is almost a carbon copy of the old one. So everyone's curious to see how this is going to be any different than the last time around, but it's on the books.
Are there certain minimum thresholds to qualify as far as how many units, or, because donating land, right, there's a parcel for sale that's unbuildable. Can they donate that?
No, there are, I didn't get into it here. It's actually kind of a complex law. There are definitely thresholds.
Okay.
Yeah, this
Thank you.
A quick question on up to 20% increase in max height requirements. Like so far on downtown where we have the 30-foot, could they go to 36?
Yes.
Okay.
But what about stories? I mean, 20% of 2 stories is 2.4, so it doesn't get you another story. So it's worthless.
I have no idea how it would work with stories. Yeah.
Yeah.
12-foot rooms.
12-foot height, low income.
CEQA. So the biggest change in CEQA this year, I think, is AB 819. So during COVID, the governor issued a number of executive orders that basically suspended a lot of the requirements under state law. Like, so for example, if you remember, we were meeting remotely in violation of the Brown Act, really, but it wasn't in violation because the executive order suspended portions of the Brown Act that allowed us all to meet remotely. The governor did certain things like this with CEQA as well. So at that time, he required the lead agency to post all materials on their website during the period required for physical posting because they didn't want people coming into the county and they didn't want people coming into City Hall. And to submit all materials electronically to the state clearinghouse's CEQA.net web portal. So AB 819 kind of codifies some of these executive orders. It allows for emailing of notices. So for those who aren't aware, when we receive a project and we're going to apply CEQA, first we have to ask ourselves, is it a project? If it is a project, is there an exemption? And if it's not exempt, before we even do the initial study, we have to determine, is this something that could have a potentially significant environmental effect? So if there is an exemption, there's going to be a notice of exemption. Now we can email that notice. We don't have to send it in the mail anymore. If there's some kind of notice of determination that we're going to have an EIR or a mitigated negative declaration or a negative declaration, that can also, so notices of determination can also be via email. We're required to post online now. So one of the tasks for the city, and I'll be working with planning on this, is to get a website up where we're actually posting these notices on our city's website. There's going to be an online state filing requirement, so basically the state clearinghouse CEQA.net web portal. If counties require online filing, that's going to be a requirement at the county level too. It's going to be up to the county. And there are extended timelines for certain projects. This certain project requirement, it applies to projects that have area or regional significance. The default timeline for review for a draft is currently 30 days for an EIR. And if it's a project with area or regional significance, they've pushed it up to 45 days. And if we're dealing with a draft negative declaration or mitigated negative declaration, the standard timeline is 20 days, and it's been pushed up to 30 days if it's of regional or area significance. And there's a definition for what that means. Any questions on CEQA? Okay, traffic regulation. Prior law only allowed street closures for a limited set of reasons. But you've probably seen a lot of street closures because of COVID and al fresco dining. Now, that was happening. Normally, all those closures would have been illegal. But because the state vehicle code preempts, the street and highways code and the vehicle code preempt our local ordinances. However, because of the state of emergency, we're able to have a lot of those street closures that you saw in every single city. Now, as you all know, the emergency order is going away February 28th. So we're going to go back to what the law was prior to all these emergency orders. The default rule is that you can close a street if it's no longer needed for vehicle traffic, in the interest of public safety, if you can meet certain findings for special events like parades and such. And there's another law that allows for street closures. It's called the Pedestrian Mall Law of 1960. That's a whole separate procedure. But now the legislator thought, you know, people kind of like this alfresco dining and we don't think it should go away. So we're going to allow cities to close off streets if they want, but pursuant to something called the Slow Streets program. So if the city adopts this, it can permanently restrict vehicle traffic on local streets with connections to bicycle networks, destinations, such as like a business district or a downtown district, or green space. So if there's some kind of park or something that the street leads to, you can close off the street leading to the park.
And in Sierra Madre in specific, where we didn't necessarily close off any streets altogether, we just took over parking, is that considered a street closure?
No,
Okay, so,
different.
okay.
Yeah.
So this would be if we decided for a month to shut down Kirsten Court. That would be an example of where this might apply.
Correct. I mean, this contemplates permanent restrictions, but I suppose, without having looked at the law, I think it probably could apply to some longer duration, yeah, because it wouldn't, if it doesn't constitute a special event, which is what the default law allows, you probably can have that closure under AB 773. Okay. And the last slide for today, it's on the open space element. So as you probably know, the general plan has 7 mandatory elements: land use, circulation, housing, which you all dealt with recently, conservation, noise, safety, open space. So the general plan also has an 8th element that's sometimes included as it's the environmental justice element, but the environmental justice element can also be incorporated into the other 7. So sometimes there is an 8th element, sometimes there isn't, depends on the city. Other cities can choose to adopt more elements if they want. You can have an unlimited number of elements, but the mandatory ones are these 7, plus including some kind of environmental justice. Under SB 1425, we are required, every city is required to update its open space element by January 1st, 2026 to address issues of social equity, climate resilience, and rewilding opportunities. Rewilding opportunities may include opportunities to preserve, enhance, and expand integrated networks of open space to support beneficial uses, such as habitat, recreation, natural resources, historic and tribal resources, water management, aesthetics, and establishing a natural communities conservation plan to provide for coordinated mitigation of impacts of new development. What's happening here is that the legislator was reviewing a lot of cities' general plans and found that the open space element is the one element that hasn't been updated in the longest time, and that's true across most cities. It's the noise ordinance and the open space element that are often the oldest in a city's general plan and just haven't been touched in years. And so the state felt that they want to force cities to kind of undertake this process of reviewing it and updating it since it hasn't been looked at in a while. So as you probably know, the housing element has an 8-year cycle for review. Unlike the housing element, this isn't going to be cyclical. This is just going to be a one-time update. And as you also know, the housing element has to be submitted to HCD for review and approval. There is no reporting requirement here. You just have to do it, and no state body is going to be reviewing it. So for those council members who just joined us, this is something you will be undertaking in the future. And that concludes my report.
So when you say open space, we have areas that are specifically zoned open space, but I think that this is a different definition of open space. Is that correct?
This is broader, I believe.
So this open space would be like the park that's right next to us?
It can be. I mean, it's going to be whatever is considered open space under our general plan. So if that definition matches exactly what's in our zoning code, then it's whatever our zoning code says. But oftentimes the general plan is broader than what's in the zoning code. So are public parks considered open space in our general plan? Do you know, Director Gonzalez? Or are those institutional?
I think we separated,
Your institution.
yeah, we separated the sort of natural open space from park and civic, right?
Civic. Right. So if it's civic, it probably wouldn't be captured by this.
So this is Mount Wilson Trail?
Yeah, and, you know, the other hillside properties that are zoned and designated open space. So I don't know, we got a lot to do.
Doesn't sound like we have a lot to do.
Yeah.
We should say it exists.
Okay,
That concludes my report, Chair.
thank you. Any questions for Mr. City Attorney? All right, thank you. We'll move on to the public hearing for design review permit 23-01 and discretionary demolition permit 23-01. Does anybody have any ex parte contacts they'd like to, excuse me, report?
Yeah, I visited the site last time we looked at this, and I also went by again today and visited again. But I didn't, on either occasion, talk to the applicant or any neighbors.
Just drove by. Yeah, I drove by this week.
Yeah, I'm familiar with it as well and had no actual contact. So with that,
So we do have a PowerPoint presentation, which is now queued up, and Senior Planner Wolf will be delivering that presentation.
Excuse me while I get set up here. Good evening, Commission. Tonight, the Commission will be reviewing Design Review Permit 2301, Discretionary Demolition Permit 2301 for a project at 346 Foothill Avenue. So for a little background on this, in April of 2022, there was a design review permit and a discretionary demolition permit approved at a staff level for a similar project that was in addition to single-family house. And a non-applicant appeal was filed following that decision. And on June 16th, 2022, the Planning Commission conducted a hearing of that appeal. The hearing concluded with the applicant electively withdrawing the project. The Planning Commission then extended a concession of application fee waiver with submittal of a new application to be reviewed in public hearing by the Commission, which is what we're hearing tonight. And the Planning Commission further provided comments on the design changes, those revisions to be made for consideration of the next submittal. So further notes from the Planning Commission's comments from June 16th are included in the agenda packet as attachment D. And furthermore, as explained in the staff report, a new application for design review permit and discretionary demolition was received on January 23rd, 2023. So the request is very similar to the last one. The additions to the existing single-family home include a second story in excess of 3,000 square feet and at a height of 29 feet 6 inches. This is a height measured to the roof ridge. And the second is to alter and modify the structure built more than 75 years prior to the filing date of the application, for which a discretionary demolition permit is required. So here's an overview of the project location. Again, it's at 346 Foothill Avenue. This is the first segment of Foothill Avenue above Grandview Avenue. It has a land use designation of residential low density in a zone of one family residential. The lot size is 9,939 square feet. And to note that the property does back up against a steeply sloping hillside, yet it is in the R1 zone. And just a little bit of a closer view on that hillside there, you can see that there is a difference, 780 feet to 840 feet, approximately 60 feet increasing towards the adjacent property at the rear. And photos of the property, very similar to what we've seen last time. On the top left is the front of the property as seen from the street. On the top right is the rear of the structure. On the lower left is, again, the front of the structure further north on the street. and on the lower right is looking up the driveway from the street. Here's some photos of the backyard area and the detached garage that does have a loft inside of it, and some of that backyard hillside area. And as far as the summary for the project data, the design does propose a height of 29 feet 6 inches. This is down from 30 feet, which may be allowed with approval of a design review permit. But I want to note that this is a height measured from the lowest point of grade to the highest point of the building. So the height measured per code, which is from the lowest point of grade to a point 1/3 the roof height above the top plate, is 21 feet. And this is up from 20 feet 9 inches. That's a very nominal amount. This height does meet code as its method of measurement is as prescribed because it is less than the 25 feet height limit. The proposed gross floor area of 3,206 square feet is down from the prior 3,222 square feet. It does not include the ADU of 558 square feet, which is permitted per government code and now city code. So the addition also jogs inward towards the west side for compliance with a minimum 5-foot setback. The lot is very narrow, so its siding, it takes advantage of that setback as much as it can. And so there's further neighborhood analysis here. I asked for an elevation at the street. So this compares neighboring structures at the street on Foothill Avenue. And you can see on the left here is the neighboring home. Above it is its photograph. And to the right of that is the other home. On the other side, its massing and its photograph. There are additional photos of the neighborhood, and they are included in attachment E of the agenda packet. Moving on to the neighborhood analysis, comparing accessible floor areas. The building size is represented as habitable area as provided by the LA County Office of the Assessor. The subject's property proposes a gross floor area that is less than the non-habitable area is 2,753 square feet. That ranks it at 6th in terms of building size amongst its neighbors, which is below the average of the top 1/3 and below the median of the top 1/3. Moving on to the existing site plan and topography. Highlighted here in orange is the area proposed for demolition and grading. The back 40 feet of the property is steeply sloped hillside, roughly 80% grade. Between the back of the garage and a chain link fence is a flatter raised terrace. West of the garage, the grade becomes much more gentle at an approximate 13% grade. This grade continues through the front of the property. And now moving on to the proposed site improvements. Those include, for low impact development, stormwater capture and drainage control. There is a stormwater flow from hillside drains along the sides of the property. Proposed improvements will capture this flow with a vegetated planting strip you see there on the lower side. This is the west side 5-foot area. Overflow from which will be captured by a bioswale at the front. The other side includes a stormwater planter within the ADU's garden. General rainfall will be captured by rain gutters mounted on roof eaves and outletting onto the bioswales at the front. Further runoff may be captured by a grass field in the front yard area.
I have a question. I don't really understand how the stormwater planter in the ADU works. And, maybe this is better for the applicant, but I just want to put it up while we have the start. So you see on the top, which is the, there's arrows that go through the ADU garden and then down the driveway. So I don't understand why there's runoff going down the driveway if there's a stormwater planter in the ADU garden, and what those arrows are trying to convey to us.
I believe those arrows are conveying existing drainage patterns, but following my presentation, I think the applicant would like to clarify that. All right, moving on to demolition plan. This is exactly the same as it was in its prior submittal, where you see highlighted in orange is the demolition at the rear of the building of all those walls except for the southern exterior wall on the 5-foot side, and all the roof planes to be demolished. Then a proposed site plan to the building footprint. Highlighted in green is the areas for addition. And those areas encompass a ground floor expansion of 739 square feet to the primary residence, a second floor addition of 595 square feet, an attached garage of 426 square feet, an attached ADU of 558 square feet, and a basement of 624 square feet, totaling less the ADU in the basement, 3,206 square feet. So here's the proposed first floor plan. This is the proposal for the permits 2301. Highlighted in blue here at the rear of the existing building is the ground floor expansion. There is an open to, above area here, and you can kind of see it. It's to the right of the stairway. This open to above ceiling area approximately measures 14 feet in height. And if we compare that with the previously proposed floor plan, you can see that area is now much more open. And we'll see later that this is due to elimination of second floor massing. And this is just shown for reference. This is the previously proposed first floor plan. Moving on to the second floor plan, we see that highlighted in blue is the 595 square foot portion. There's a little hatching area there along the side portion. This is area with a floor to ceiling height less than 7 feet 6 inches, and thus not captured by gross floor area count. Additionally, the area of the stairs is already captured in the first floor, so it's not counted twice. And in this floor plan program, there is simply a primary bedroom with attached bathroom and closet space. Comparing that to the previously proposed second floor plan, you can see how there's a big difference here. What's happening is there's an elimination of 15-foot depth from the front of the second floor massing. But because that massing includes a open to below area, stairs to the loft, and this other loft portion, that reduction is pretty nominal, about 16 square feet. But again, comparing that back and forth with the current proposal, knocking off 15 foot of depth from the front, the massing change is actually quite significant. And furthermore, the difference here in the new proposal is there's no roof deck anymore. So that's eliminated compared with its prior submittal. Okay, moving on to the basement floor plan. So this one hasn't really changed much in terms of its size, but its programming did change. We'll see, just because the way the stairs had to be reoriented, now the wine room and the storage areas are in different places. So this is the previously proposed with mechanical room and the wine room on the side end. And in the new proposal, this has just been shifted in towards the front. Moving on to section elevations. The section on top of the slide is the proposed design with the western half removed and looking in at the eastern half's interior. And because the property is sloped at an approximate 13% grade, required angle plane is demonstrated for each of the sections below, showing that the proposed design falls under the required angle plane. You see that on slide with the red lines that start vertically up 10 feet from grade and 45 degrees in. And section number 2, cutting at the garage, demonstrates that the code prescribed method for measuring height up to the first 1/3 of the roof height above the top plate is at 21 feet. Ceiling height in the second story volume is 14 feet. It's continuous with the interior ridge of the of the dormer, and interrupting the height of the interior ridge of the main roof with ceiling and structural ties. As mentioned before, the ceiling height of the first floor addition measures 14 feet, primarily due to ceiling terminating at the flat portion of the hipped roof. And now I'd just like to compare its previous section elevations. Here you can really see where the massing of the second floor has been reduced. So here again is the previous section, and comparing that to the now new section. The longitudinal section cut here on the top of the slide is where you see most of that being shaved off. There's very subtle differences in the other sections here, but I'll go over that a little bit later. Moving on to exterior elevations, one of Planning Commission's concerns for the second floor dormer, and this was a dormer shown, you see here on the lower part of the slide here, there's a dormer that intersects with the first floor and roof deck. And that area has been addressed by eliminating the dormer along with all the building mass that projects towards the front. As you can see here in this slide, there's only one dormer, and it is standalone. It does not intersect with any other building portions. Additionally, you may notice that the roof massing of the ADU has been reduced in kind more to the massing of the existing structure. So there is the previous, now proposed, more in proportion to the existing. Moving on to the rear and front elevations. On slide are the proposed rear and front elevations. And there's not really going to be a huge difference on either of these elevations, but the wall that surrounds the ADU's garden and it retains the earth behind it has been shown here. The rear elevation. And you can also see that reduction in ADU's roof massing exposes more of the addition's exterior. So you can see more of that half-timbered treatment. The front elevation really, it's a lot cleaner. I'll show the prior elevation there and see where the roof deck hides a lot of that exterior, but the current proposal is much more cleaned up. There's a single dormer. There's no awkward intersecting or doorways leading out onto a roof deck anymore. So again, there's the previous. Moving on to materials and colors. This has stayed the same since its prior submittal. The roof material will be a gray slate roof. It matches the existing. There will be architectural timber Douglas fir treatment to match the existing. Vintage red brick cladding, also matching existing clay architectural features for gable vents. Anodized aluminum gray dual pane windows and off-white troweled stucco cladding to match the existing exterior and color. Here are some further details of the windows and doors. And moving on to 3D perspective models. On the top of the slide is a 3D perspective model viewed from the street slightly north of the property. The lower left is up the driveway looking towards the front, viewing slightly towards the addition. And on the lower right is again the front, but further south on the street. Moving on, we have some aerial perspective models that you can see the roof and massing from above. Moving right along, I have photo montages. The first is the front of the property at the street, again slightly north of the property. And this shows that the addition is very well set back. And from the south part of Foothill, you can see barely that the addition is kind of there, almost not. But as viewed from the front of the property, practically invisible. And finally, findings for a design review permit. So all of the findings have been met. The proposed project remains single family in use. It meets all of the development requirements in accordance with the R1 one-family residential code. The proposed additions are sited primarily at the rear, where adjacent properties further north are at higher elevations, and adjacent properties at the south are subject of the subject property at lower elevations, thereby siting the addition in a location with the least potential interference of use, possession, enjoyment upon neighbors. The proposed additions are compatible with the original Tudor architecture, where brick cladding, steeply pitched roofs, and half-timbered treatment of walls are used by reference to complement the original home. The second-story volume is deeply set back from the front property, thereby having little to no dominance amongst the neighborhood. The proposed design, with ground floor level at the rear raised above the ground floor level, follows the landform of the property, grading at approximately 13%, and finds opportunity to develop a full basement. Massing of the second story is designed in such that the envelope resembles the landform. There is a coherent project-wide design demonstrated by the proposed elevations and renderings, where it is apparent by details of the original Tudor style and have been continued consistently on each elevation. The proposed design includes a height of 29 feet 6 inches, but again, this is measured from the lowest point of grade to the highest point of the structure. But it is necessary to achieve a full compatible and coherent Tudor style, as a steeply sloped pitch roof is a classic feature of the style. However, it should be noted that the height measures 21 feet as prescribed by the code. The proposed project is a custom design intended to expand the home and enhance its original Tudor style. The siding of the project is primarily located in the least graded portions of the property, extending towards the rear and against the base of a hillside. It's respecting and preserving the privacy and views for neighbors and occupants. High quality materials intended specifically to enhance the existing Tudor architectural style are used throughout the building. This will also be required to meet high efficiency energy requirements. Water saving features are demonstrated by the proposed improvements addressing low impact development, stormwater capture, and drainage control. And moving on to discretionary demolition permit findings. There has been a historic evaluation report which concluded that the property is not eligible for listing as a local landmark. Demolition activities are intended for the purpose of expanding the home and do not change or alter the use of the land. Demolition will modify the exterior of the home and preserve a large portion of the front. Expansion will be consistent in design, material, and color to the original. The demolition of exterior walls is necessary to accommodate the expansion of the home's interior floor space. The demolition will not encourage change of use of the property, and the public interest, convenience, and necessity are met where demolition is required to expand the home to accommodate a family of an average size, improve the land value, and by extent the value of homes within its neighborhood. Alternatives before the Planning Commission tonight are to adopt the Planning Commission resolution as presented. This approves the request for design review permit and discretionary demolition permit, subject to conditions of approval. The other alternatives are to adopt that resolution with modifications, deny the request, directing staff to prepare a resolution citing reasons and findings for denial, or continue the public hearing and provide direction to staff and the applicant. Staff's recommendation to the commission is to adopt the planning commission resolution as presented. That concludes my presentation, but I'd like to mention that there was one public comment received and filed to the record. There was one later public comment received a little later. Both were in support of the project. There was also a question brought up to staff regarding tree protection and with regard to an oak believed to have been removed some time ago and whether that would have an effect on this proposed project. And I'd like to point out that the city's tree specialist did review this project and provided a comment that no arborist report or tree protection conditions apply to this project since there aren't any protected trees on or encroaching onto the site. And the applicant is also here and may or may not have a presentation based on tonight's discussion.
All right. Are there questions for staff? All right. Would the applicant like to present or not present?
Well, I had that one question about the drainage, about how that works. That's the only question I have.
Yeah, so.
If you wouldn't mind coming up to the podium, thank you.
So the arrows that you saw coming up from the top part of the hill, those arrows represent the natural drainage of the land, right? So they sheet flow down the hill, and they go through the driveway and out to the street gutter that goes into the storm drain. The lid addresses the drainage that comes from the roof. Does that address your question?
So the drainage that comes on the slope in the back, that's going to come down into the ADU garden and be trapped in the.
No, that remains the same. So it'll come either through weep holes on the retaining wall, through the deck and down the driveway as it does now, or it will be captured in the bioswale as well.
Okay, because I mean, one concern I have is that if you put a retaining wall in to put the ADU garden, that it diverts that drainage onto the neighbor.
No, it shouldn't. Plus, the bioswale that we showed is big enough to capture the drainage that's coming off from the roof and the sheet flow that's coming up from the natural grade.
Okay.
So from the natural grade, there's things that can be developed. I mean, the lid plan that we show is pretty rudimentary for the purposes of this presentation, but once we get into it, if we move forward, those are things that can be developed as we go along.
Okay, because the other thing is like on the, was it sort of north or west side, you show it coming down and then being the sheet drainage being trapped,
Mm-hmm.
and then into the bioswale. And I was wondering on the east or southeast side where that sheet drainage comes down, if you could put like a little drain across to capture
Right.
and then direct into the bioswale.
Yeah, and we haven't gotten that far on that design, but we have a civil engineer that will be addressing that. Typically, it's the sheet flow that's coming down from the hill. It's addressed with either a V ditch with a pipe that goes out to the street, or it sheet flows down the driveway. I think we have a few options to address. We can develop it more if that's for the purposes of this phase. But if we move forward, the civil engineer will be getting a hold of that.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
May I follow up? It's common practice when the city reviews grading, drainage, and LID plans that it's ensured that there is no cross-lot drainage intensified or reduced in all practicality for all projects that require LID grading and drainage.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Any other questions for the applicant?
Nope, I'm okay.
questions.
All right, then at this time, we will take public comment for this agendized item. Hearing none, we will bring it back to the commission for deliberation. Who'd like to start?
Since I went first last time, I'll let somebody else go first if someone is inclined.
I think, I wasn't here last time, but, seeing everything that's changed from last time, I'm almost amazed that it was only 16 square foot less than before, just with the reduction in the size of that second story. There's been, I think, a lot of concessions since it was last looked at, with the removal of the deck and the smaller second story. I like it. I like the look of it. So.
Commissioner Hutt?
Yeah, I think this is a big improvement from the last iteration, and I liked the overall design then, but I think it appeared too bulky and too tall, and I think this is a big improvement. And I think it goes to show that you can have an objective measurement like the square footage, and it doesn't necessarily capture the feel of the bulkiness. Where here, technically, this is just a few square feet shorter or less, but it's a lot less bulky looking. With regard to the drainage, I'm just reviewing the conditions of approval and the lid plan, and I think that's going to cover it. So, and I appreciate your attention to that in your answers. So I feel comfortable that's going to get done properly. I think one other thing to keep in mind is that the second story portion, I appreciate the reducing the massing there, bringing some of the program into a basement. Also, the placement of that is back from the street, so it's not going to appear as big. Also, it looks over the neighbor's driveway, and there's not very many windows there, and they're sort of high, so it's not going to like look down into and take up their privacy. But I think the main thing to keep in mind about how the massing is going to appear is because that second story sets so far back, and then there's that big hill, it's really going to conceal the appearance of massing. Because when I looked at some of the elevations on their own, and then if you look at the photo montages, you really get an idea of how that massing is going to look less imposing than it could in a different situation. And so I think one of the things, finding 8A, where we talk about how it fits into its site as opposed to just being generic or cookie cutter, I think this does a good job of fitting into its site and taking advantage of the conditions that are there and addressing them. So I can approve this and make the findings. Thank you.
See, I agree with a lot of the comments that have already been said. I think that it's most evident in your north elevation where you're looking at the side view of that thing and how it was reduced down. I think you've sort of taken the thoughts of probably your neighbors and accommodated some of those moves. I think it makes sense architecturally, and the massing of it, how we're going into it, the massing of it is set back, so it doesn't impact sort of the street view of that. And I know that on the ADU portion even, the roof was reduced down to match sort of the similar, the roofing of the existing house, where you do have a portion that's a flat roof versus the sloped roof. I mean, maybe this was something that you had to concede out for your neighbor views and all of that, but I would have even been okay with doing more of a conventional roof that you had before, instead of going with this idea of creating a flat and a slope roof, and but that's, I think, something, maybe it was a conversation that you've already had or something, but I think I would have been okay with even that on the ADU side of it, to do a cleaner sloped roof. But otherwise, I think I agree with a lot of the comments, and I would be for approving as is. So, thank you.
I would like to thank the applicant for being so responsive to the comments that were received previously. The findings that I think we were having a bit of a challenge with before were findings 3 and 4 with the height, bulk, and massing, and every project that comes before us, we always talk about that articulation and set it back, and that's exactly what you did. And that changed so much of this. I think the other thing that was a little tough for us was number 6, the coherent project-wide design with those extra dormers that were there before, and the elimination of that. Just, you've removed everything that we mentioned and were incredibly responsive to the feedback we gave you, so thank you. I have no qualms at all about approving this project, and so I would love a motion to do so.
Okay. I'll move adoption of Planning Commission Resolution 2306, approving design review permit 2301 and discretionary demolition permit 2301.
Second?
All those in favor?
Aye.
Passes unanimously. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, next up, we have a discussion on the Planning Commission project forecast list.
And we are going to queue up the Word document so we can view that on screen in one moment. So at a prior meeting, the Planning Commission did ask to revisit the Planning Commission, I'm calling it now the forecast list, project forecast list. And we identified about 7 items that were on there. I added one additional one that I wanted to have a discussion on, which was number 7. But the list that we originally had was to amend the ordinance regarding development criteria limits on plate height. That was from a recent discussion from the commission. So definitely, instead of including that as a general amendment, I think we needed to discuss that a little further. So that's something we can do. I think that can be solved fairly simply. We also talked about, in response to some of the state's decisions to remove authority from the subjective criteria from the planning commissions and the city in general, we want to look at creating development guidelines, and standards booklet was the term that was used. And I think that's really going to be more in line with the development criteria. And I think that could certainly achieve objective standards that would comply with state requirements. We would also look at that as also both for residential and commercial properties. So creating either design guidelines or criteria, development criteria. Number 4, looking at design review for multifamily, including the commercial zone mixed-use projects, or considering additional objective standards. Again, the same kind of issue for number 2 and 3. Number 5 addresses the multifamily and commercial code with regard to lack of design review to create objective development standards. More of the same. We've tried doing that in the past. I think the proposal is possibly to secure a consultant to help develop some of these initial concepts. Of course, that a consultant will collaborate with the Planning Commission and staff. Number 6 is to explore if variances from applicable objective development standards can be reviewed subjectively. Again, it's all in line with the same authority that came down from the state. And I added the soft first story ordinance. We did look at all the unreinforced masonry in the past. Our buildings have all been in compliance with state requirements. So this is the next item. I had already already had a contract in queue with our Wildan Engineering to help us work through some of those issues and then bring that to the commission as a discussion item and then eventually an ordinance. Do we have any comments on the first 7? Or if there are any additions that we want to identify?
Yeah, I think, what, you know, a lot of these are sort of interrelated, except for maybe like number 1, if you want to pull that out. But I think I have a concern when we talk about development guidelines and standards booklet and hiring a consultant that we start to make this a really, really big project that, given the way politics works here, doesn't ever get done. And I think especially when you talk about number 5, the fact that we can't do design review, subjective design review, we have a pretty big hole in our code. And we have a situation that the average person who looks at the code who doesn't understand the interactions with state law and things like that can say, wow, this is really daunting. I'm just not going to do my little project. But somebody who knows the game, you know, can play it and do something without any kind of review at all. And I think it would be helpful for us to think of this as more of a 2-step thing where we take out the requirement for the design review permit that we can't apply by state law. So it's clear to anyone who reads it. And then we try to put in just, you know, a few basic objective standards that prevent the really nasty abuses. I think, to my mind, it's the plate height, it's some of the height games, it's the lack of articulation. I mean, I think we can do a lot of that without a consultant and pretty quickly. And then, you know, down the road, hopefully someday, get a development guidelines and standard booklet, which, you know, can be in a lot of ways informative. But I just would like to plug that hole before too much time goes by, because all we need is one project that gets built where somebody understands the loopholes, and we could get a lot of people in town really upset. And then we overreact and do, you know, clamp down stuff that doesn't make sense, or we do stuff that's contrary to state law and they get in lawsuits, and I think that's been an unfortunate pattern in our past that I hope we can remedy. The other thing is, there's a couple of items which I think are cleanup items, but maybe they're a little bit more than cleanup items, and I just wanted to bring them up and see if we wanted to address those in the cleanup section when that comes back to us, or we want to separately agendize it. And one is, and I think it goes from the fact that when the commercial code was approved, there was a lot of changes right at the end. It was sort of rushed, and there were some parts that didn't work. And so you've got these footnotes in the code, in the use tables, that don't work. And some of those are pretty easy that we can just say they need to be deleted because they were to some stuff that didn't get approved. But there's a couple of things with regard to residential. One is that we say residential uses are just allowed, and we have no development guidelines about those residential uses at all. So that means, at least in code, you can put residential development on the boulevard right on the storefront, right? Or on Sierra Madre Boulevard, which is totally contrary to our general plan, and I think was just an oversight. And we want to say you can't put residential development, you know, on the ground floor in the front to match the general plan. The other thing is, we were specifically told by HCD that we had to allow SROs in the commercial code, which we've told them we have. But all we've done is say residential uses are allowed. And we've got a definition of SROs, and then we never use it in the code. So either that means SROs are allowed anywhere there's residential uses, so you can put them anywhere in town, or they're not allowed in the commercial code where we said they were. So those two things I think we should clean up. hopefully we can do it as part of the cleanup. But if we feel like that's, moving too far into a policy area as opposed to just a cleanup thing, then I think we should agendize those items pretty quickly. Or at least when we look at sort of cleaning up some of the C code design review questions.
Any other comments on these first items?
One of the excuse me. One of the things I think we need to either make a policy recommendation on or be given policy feedback from council on is with the changes to ADU laws and the fact that now by right you can just add 1,200 square feet of building on top of whatever our code currently allows, should we consider reducing our floor area coverage laws so that we don't end up 1,200 square feet over everything?
Yeah, is it 800 or 1,200 that is allowed?
800 by right.
And Director Gonzalez, didn't the City Council consider this relatively recently?
I believe they did, and I thought that they felt that it would penalize, in general, the homeowner, especially those who had never had an intent to have an addition.
I think that maybe this was, maybe it was explained to them in a way that is a more draconian reduction that we're thinking about. But one of the things to keep in mind is that in R1, section 172125B includes extra square footage for accessory buildings and second units in the square footage. And then per state law, you can get more. So we're double allowing, right? I mean, that's, at a minimum, we should take out the extra for second units that the state law allows you to put on. I think the easiest fix here would just be to say, we've got sort of two FAR rules in R1, is just take the simple one at 1720.125A and say that applies to everybody, and then cut out the other one and say, except for the first 800 square feet of an ADU, which doesn't count by state law. And that way we don't have to put this warning on the ADUs, which I fear the HCD is going to get mad at us for. And if somebody, does their does their ADU first, they can still add, their small room addition or whatever. But it sort of evens out and levels the playing field, I think.
Right. As Commissioner Hutt's talking, I think what came to mind is probably the best thing to do, because the council has already considered this, is maybe to have the commission's council liaison raise it and potentially agendize it as a future agenda item at the end of a city council meeting if she chooses. Because I know the rest of the council's heard it, but your council liaison, as your representative, is likely going to want to address it. If that is agendized, I think it would make most sense if someone from the commission can be present to make the case for this.
Yeah, I think that would be good, because I don't know when, I've heard that this was considered by the council in the past, but we never heard about it, and we never got to explain why we think it's useful. And the fact that we're not talking about like massive reductions or anything, like just taking away, 800 or 1,400 square feet from everybody. It's just sort of cleaning up some of the inconsistencies so you don't get double square footage.
It was considered in the last iteration of the ADU ordinance amendments, and it was just one of many issues that they considered. So, perhaps the points that you're raising, Commissioner, were lost upon them, or weren't presented.
And we have some out-of-sync parking, don't we?
I think the out-of-sync parking we're fixing with the cleanup, right? With the covered nature and there was two holes with the parking. One is that we took the covered requirement out of parking and we meant it to be put into the other underlying zones, but in some cases it didn't. And I
Right.
thought we were fixing that in the cleanup. And then the other thing is, in commercial code, there's a different parking standard for the prime storefront area than the non. And I think that's being cleaned up as part of the cleanup things that we saw last time.
Yes, so the covered parking requirement in the parking code in general is being cleaned up to include covered parking and to clean up its definition for interior clearance of space. I wasn't aware if there was any issue with parking calculation for the prime storefront area. To my knowledge, that was in the code already as intended, but I can double check that. And then to Chair Dennison's point, I just wanted to clarify, were you referring to parking code in general or parking code for ADU?
I was not referring to parking code for ADU.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, I think the issue is the definition of prime storefront area isn't in the code that's online now. And that might have just been an oversight when it was uploaded. But in any event, we need that definition in the code so that people know where that applies when they do the parking calculations for the commercial and industrial areas.
I will note that, thank you.
As you can see, Associate Planner Wolf is making live edits as we go through our discussion. So the second component of this, if we scroll down, the numbering is probably a little bit different now, but okay. So we also decided to resurrect the old general plan implementation that is to be required to be completed within certain timeframes. When we first adopted the general plan, we made quite a bit of headway into updating much of the zoning code, and which led to many of the the upgrades to the commercial code and so forth. So these are some of the remaining items. There's actually quite a long list to be completed by 2020 to 2025. So even on the first go around, we never quite made it to the R2 zone. Given the state's direction, do we just eliminate that and go R3, or is R2 going to be more in compliance with the state? There's really not many regulations imposed in R2. But that's something we're going to have to discuss and look at. Development standards, number 2, development standards update. Again, this is looking at very much like what we talked about, establishing guidelines to minimize direct sight lines of sight between neighboring homes and backyards. And we were looking at trying to see if we can come up with objective criteria to address this concern. The residential canyon zone also identified specific objectives. They are to provide incentives to encourage open porches and discourage enclosures of porches in non-habitable areas. Include incentives to encourage the use of materials typical of existing development of the canyon. Protect natural elements such as large rocks, plants, and trees. Include site plan standards for development of lots that include or are adjacent to the flood control channel. And continue to allow the Nature Friends property to be used for other uses such as overnight guest accommodations, group meetings, etc. And discretionary review process to allow park and open space areas. I'm not sure where all these came from, if anybody had any insight during the formation of the general plan. I think a lot of these are already addressed.
Yeah, I think that, when we last updated the canyon zone, it was a pretty comprehensive process. And so I think we've covered some of this stuff, but, I think, you know, a quick refresh, I think the Canyon Zone's probably one of the ones that functions the best. So I don't know if we want to take a quick look at it and just see if there's anything that we think needs to be tweaked to do any of these things. I think, you know, when we do general plan kind of stuff, we always talk about including incentives as if it means something, but the city never has any money to throw at things, and so I don't know what incentives we can do to do this.
I was going to ask what they meant by incentives.
And if anyone has any fabulous ideas, you know, throw them out, but
Because it can't be more square footage in the canyon. There's just no room.
there's no room. Unless what you want to do is throttle square footage for other people and then give it back for this, but there's probably not the appetite for that given our talk about the ADUs, right? So I don't know what you do about that. And I don't know how you protect large rocks.
Leave 'em alone.
Just hope that people recognize it costs a lot of money to take them out and it's best to leave them. But yeah, I think maybe this could be sort of a quick glance at the RC code and refresh anything that we think needs to, and maybe do a little outreach to the canyon to try to get, you know, people to come on down and share their concerns.
So looking at number 4, which is again, the commercial parking code update. Some of the measures that were identified, implementation measures, require windows and doorways along the street front elevations to create more of a street frontage presence, landscaping, incorporation of signage into overall building design, which brings up another issue. I don't know if City Council, Planning Commission has ever thought of updating our sign ordinance.
We did the sign ordinance, I was gonna say just a little while ago, but now I'm doing the math.
I think it was before me, so
It was my first turn, so that was,
8 years ago.
no, it was like 15 years ago. So, yeah, it was just recently done. So, we might want to take a look at that as well.
We can add that to the forecast list.
I think with regard to R2, I don't know if it really does us a lot of good to maintain a separate R2 code. I think maybe if we can do some of those sort of quick updates to the multifamily, the R3 and the multifamily in the C zone, and then decide really whether we want R2 to be just a special paragraph in R1 or a special paragraph in R3. Because it seems to me that you say, you know, either you go the R3 route and it's everything you do there just a little bit less, or you go R1, everything there just a little bit more. And, you know, we recognize that because it's multifamily, we're not going to be able to do design review because of the state, so we just try to put in a few objective criteria to prevent the biggest abuses, and that's about all we can do.
Yeah, that's why I made my comment that I don't know if we want to go either direction.
I mean, it's multifamily, so it's more like the R3.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can sort of say, yeah, you know, you're limited to the 2 dwelling units, the FAR is a little bit lower, and otherwise you just apply R3.
And we don't have significant areas of R2 zoning.
Yep. And that, I think, would function better than, because the R2 code now is just, you've got parts that don't work.
So continuing on with the commercial/parking code update, implementation measures, second bullet point or third bullet point, encourage the enhancement of rear entrances to existing businesses, require new construction adjacent to parking areas to include access from the parking area and the street, identify opportunities to improve pedestrian access from public parking, especially from the Mariposa lot, develop directional signage, and prohibit new and the expansion of institutional facilities, allow a diversity of commercial uses for residents and visitors. When we did update the commercial code, we did identify many of these,
Yeah, I
try
think,
to address many of these issues.
I think we addressed a lot of the parking stuff and some of the commercial code updates got left on the editing room floor. One way to put it. And then I think there's other parts of this that are, sort of outside of zoning. Develop a directional signage program, which I think is really important, but I don't know that we address that by code updates that, the downtown development district or those type of things, that seems like more,
Public Works.
yeah, their ballpark than what we do.
Shall we go down to the manufacturing code, number 5? Additional implementation measures allow adaptive reuse of the existing structures for mixed-use light manufacturing, craft-related businesses, entertaining, specialty stores, professional office, live workspace. Some of that is present along East Montecito.
Right, yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, and we had wanted to go in, in fact, as part of cleanup, I bet you could find that list of things like the rabbit processing facility and
I
the
think
like that
we got rid of the rabbit in one, later cleanup.
I thought that we ended up not getting rid of it.
I think rabbit's gone. Rabbit slaughtering is gone.
It is gone. Okay.
Okay.
Because I remember that we wanted to go through and spend some time cleaning that up, and we were
Right.
told not yet. So that was one of the next zones that I thought we were going to tackle.
Yeah,
And in the past, because I found old documents downstairs that I guess were part of a subcommittee or a citizen-based subcommittee representing the Montecito district. But nothing's ever been done for that segment of town.
yeah, a lot of starts doing things and not a lot of finishes.
Never
But I think
Codified, yeah.
to a certain extent, we address the adaptive reuse by the adaptive reuse code that applies citywide. And then the commercial code updates
And
that
the
we
underlying
did do
commercial code, right?
apply in Montecito, and we did a couple of cleanups to address some of the things. So I think we got the code at least working a little better, but there's more room that we could do there if we wanted to.
There's also establish a program to provide incentives to encourage the addition of street trees. Change the title from manufacturing to artisan mixed use. That goes back to some of the earlier proposals that really never made it any further. Require approval of a CUP to allow a new user on a site to adequately protect existing adjacent uses. I'm not sure what that means.
Yeah, I don't think that's the trend of how things are going now.
Mm.
And as far as the incentive trees and whatnot, I think that's a great idea. I just don't know much how we would do that in zoning.
Number 6, institutional code updates. Require compatibility with adjacent land uses. Require approval of a master plan to allow the expansion of institutional sites. That's already in the code. And so is the reference to showing compatibility of an institutional use with the adjacent residential uses in this case. Relocated large institutions, retreat centers, civic and religious uses, nonprofit or health organizations, housing for institutional users, parkland, open space, public recreation, and schools. For the reuse of existing properties or adaptive reuse could apply to those kind of types of uses. Prohibit a change of use zone change of school sites that would allow for use other than educational uses.
mean, maybe, I mean, we address that when we update the open space element.
Yeah,
It talks about open
that
space.
consideration has been given to cities' open space and recreational needs.
I think we dealt a little bit with the first bullet when we dealt with the housing element, right? Because we allowed for housing in institutional uses.
Yes.
I don't know if there's anything in here that's, I mean, effectively, our institutional code sort of punts towards a master plan for each institutional use.
Mhm.
And unless we want to really bulk that out, which seems a big chore for a little city, I don't know if we don't just live with that and, make tweaks around the edges, like housing and the institutional uses, deal with some of the open space element issues when that gets done in the general plan.
Well, if we require the master plan, if we require it to not be consistent with the master
Right,
plan,
findings indicate
right,
that, yes.
right, so then that's how that would get handled, and then we don't have to do anything, right?
Right. I think the concern was about the first bullet was the incremental creep of institutional uses doing just a little project here and a little project there instead of, and punting on the master plan. But, we saw Alverno do their master plan, so that's not, that small project creep isn't an issue for them, so we just need to be vigilant about any other institutional uses that don't have approved master plans.
And I've been approached and they've started and stopped, but I think funding is a big issue, a deterrent regarding especially the churches in town.
Yeah, understandable.
And Vice Chair, if we did amend the institutional code, I would recommend removing the allowance. I think you mentioned it. Anything that could be interpreted as housing, including dormitories. For example, because dormitories could be considered potentially housing under state law, the planning commission would lose the authority to review that discretionarily, even though it's in the institutional zone. So I think it's probably best to separate out all kinds of residential housing from the institutional zone, would be my recommendation.
Didn't we just recently create an overlay district that specifically allowed housing in order to help get our numbers for HCD?
But not in the institution. Well, I mean, an
Yeah,
overlay
because it was
for
on the
institution.
overlay for the churches.
Oh, yeah, right,
Yes, for affordable housing development.
Right.
right. Yeah. And that was the intention with that affordable housing overlay.
Okay, so it was only
That was
affordable housing, so that wouldn't include dormitories if they were affordable.
Well, no, if the dormitories were affordable, it might qualify under the overlay, but they could build a multifamily structure today, call it a dormitory, and then we would have a fight over whether or not that's a dormitory or multifamily
I
structure.
think the concern there is when we did the overlay, we put in certain objective criteria and affordability requirements, and the dormitory is just a word, right? So there's no bulwark or framework that goes around that, and so it's open to large potential for abuse.
Mhm.
Okay.
Number 7, civic code update. Allow for government agency service buildings that are easily accessible to residents and other users, and allow for the development of public cultural facilities. Not much to say there.
I mean, do we need to really do any zoning for that? I haven't even
think so.
ever looked at our civic zoning code. It probably says whatever the city wants.
Unless it's referring to accessibility. Could be, but
And to the extent, I don't know if public schools are in civic zoning, but they answer to their own drummer anyhow, so if they're building schools, we don't really control that.
Number 8, open space code update. Obviously, we're going to be required to be addressing this issue, so we'll get into that in more detail. But it just identifies the preservation of natural open space, conservation easements, etc. Number 9, historic preservation. Establish historic overlay zones or districts. We've talked about that extensively with City Council. Cost prohibitive, and we implemented a process that'll eventually get us there in a number of years by hiring a consultant that we sole source all our reviews for buildings over 75 years of age. It brought down the cost considerably, and we're building an historic survey over time. Remove constraints on the use of historic structures. I think that's pretty much in there as well, not only the historic building code, but also even through our review of designated properties with a certificate of appropriateness at no cost. I'm not sure if there's much more we can do there.
I think that the single source historic evaluations is worked out really well, because it brought the cost down tremendously for the applicant. It provided uniformity of review for us. And it's also, the people that do it, I really feel confidence in, that they know what they're doing, and they don't fall in love with every building and say it should be historic. It's really the ones that should be. And so I think that one step has really moved tremendously to remove constraints.
When was that established? Single source.
We did that maybe about, what do you think, Josh, about 3 years ago or longer?
Before I did.
2019.
But right after.
Yeah.
Third bullet point, include guidelines for rehabilitation and new construction, demolition control, and regulation of uses in historically designated structures. The next bullet point, include appropriate methods such as, but not limited to, tax incentives, protective covenants, and preservation easements to help preserve historic resources. The tax incentives is applicable to the Mills Act contract,
Right.
so I think we addressed that there.
Yeah, I think we've hit this one pretty well.
Do we know how many Mills Act properties we have in Sierra Madre?
Oh, you just missed the report?
Yeah,
we just
we
missed
just
it.
covered that like
I think we're now
4
up to-
meetings ago.
Yeah, I think it was.
Okay. Darn.
Yeah, we have 26.
26. Thought there'd be more.
Well, there's more on the historic list, but not all of those
Not
are
on the
Mills.
Mills.
Yeah.
Right.
That choose to do it, yeah.
I think that concludes our overview of what's to come for the 2020 to 2025 update for general plan. Actually, I think we're in pretty good shape, because this list was much, much longer,
Yeah.
and we've whittled that back over the past 8 years.
Good job.
Thank you. Having led that effort, thank you.
No, I think, the thing is, as after this general plan update was last done, and we started doing code updates, a lot of the things we updated didn't get updated from the last general plan, right? And we were looking at stuff that was 20, 30 years old. So I think we made a lot of progress, and I think, we still have a few steps to go. But a lot of that stuff is that we've accomplished a lot of good stuff, and a lot of that stuff that's out there is the, provide incentives for, which is a lot of times not a zoning issue and just an issue of how do you find money to do that kind of thing.
As a person who reviews the city's code often, the zoning code is, you can see it's been updated very frequently. All the different sections have been updated relatively frequently. And all the other sections that are outside chapter 17 haven't been touched in decades.
Yeah, as part of the update, there's some of the just naming changes that went into different chapters, and I hazarded a view, and so I was like, wow, I don't even want to look at this. Some of that stuff is as bad as our zoning code used to be.
So that concludes our discussion item on this topic for this evening, unless you had any other suggestions.
So what is our next step on does this go to the city council to prioritize? Do we talk about prioritizing, or?
Well, a lot of these issues did go to the city council early on, especially all of the general plan objectives. They're there. We know we have the time frame that's already established, so I think we could prioritize them. We can ask council if they wanted to weigh in on that also.
I think one of the things that's changed a little bit, since we did the general plan update and started updating all these things, is the fact that the state law basically doesn't allow us to do subjective design review on multifamily at all. And so, we updated R3, and because R3 uses are allowed in C as well, apply there with the thought that we could do that subjective design review. So I think that's a big hole that perhaps we didn't understand last time we talked about prioritizing. So I really think it makes sense to alter the existing list and bump those up to the top to address it. And again, I think it's a two-step thing, because we need to address the hole that's there and put a few objective criteria in, and then we can come back later when we have more time and do a more fulsome review.
And I saw that number 6, it said explore if variances from applicable objective development standards can be reviewed subjectively, I think was the question. And the answer is yes. So if we're using the variance procedure, that means that they haven't satisfied the city's objective standards. They want something else. And if they want something else, then they're subject to a subjective review by this body through the variance procedure.
Yeah, there's a couple examples of this in our current code, where, for instance, on the height limit, we say in R1 the height limit is 25, but you can go to 20 or you can go to 30 if it matches the architectural style, and we make an additional finding, right? So there's that, and then there's also in the hillside management zone, we have a thing where subterranean isn't counted, above ground is counted, but semi-subterranean we can review and approve either a partial or full reduction out of the square footage. And so we have some examples like that now. I think there's a finding in the institutional code that says we can deviate from development standards with certain findings. And so I think that if we can do that kind of thing, there's abilities to do things like, in R1, we might say the second floor, the floor area of the second floor has to be no more than X% of the first, 50, 2/3, 75, whatever. But if you wanted to get more, then you could do it with a design review permit. And that way, there are some, styles that do have that box look. And sometimes you can make it look good, but a lot of times you can't. And so if you're going to go just through the objective route, I'd want to be able to shrink that and then, but, preserve the right of somebody who really wants to go there with a barn with a rail car in the back. But,
Well, to your point, so if for example you wanted that additional height, and you had some kind of guideline governing what that additional height, when you would grant that additional height, and you wanted to be able to review that, perhaps the way to go then is to have a stricter height limit and a hard cutoff, and then, like you're saying, everything above that will have to apply for a variance.
Yeah.
but the variance procedure, I mean, it could even be a tiered variance with like different fee structures, to incentivize certain types of things to come forward while disincentivizing others. The findings for a variance are under state law, so you have to make the same findings, the same, I think, 2 required findings. However, you could also add, additional findings along the lines of the guidelines for like height, when it's acceptable, when it's not acceptable. I don't know if that made sense, but strict standards and all of the exceedances can be allowed for through the variance procedure if findings are made.
Yeah, I think if we could accomplish that would provide a lot of ability, I think, to put in objective standards that are reasonable and people could build a nice house or a multifamily or whatever, but, allow the architectural creativity if somebody wants to build something weird and different and whatnot. But then we at least get to see it, and the stuff that is built of right is going to be not ugly, at least.
Yep. Okay, anything more on that?
I think we've exhausted that discussion, and we'll bring it back as
All right.
necessary.
At this time, we'll take public comment from anybody who would like to comment on this specific agendized item. Seeing none. Planning Commission reports. Any planning commissioners have anything to report?
I think staff told us last time the Alverno master plan was appealed to city council, and the first hearing was 2 days ago, and I went to that, and there was a lot of interesting information, and then there's going to be a second one where Alverno gets to present in March sometime. I don't remember the date.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be able to make it to the March one, but if anybody wants to go,
March
Yeah.
16th.
Okay. Nobody else?
Oh, 14th. Oh, I'm looking at the Planning Commission, yeah. 14th.
All right, Planning and Community Preservation Department reports.
So we do have another meeting scheduled for March 2nd, and we're continuing actually public hearings now for both the ADU ordinance and general ordinance cleanup items that you discussed at prior meeting. Did you want to talk about the referendum?
Sure. So despite our best efforts, the city the city was trying to negotiate a withdrawal of the referendum that was mutually acceptable to all parties involved. The city was unfortunately unsuccessful, so we received a letter last Friday that the proponents of the referendum will not withdraw, and so the city council scheduled an election. We have a special election scheduled for May 8th. The issue is going to be basically whether or not to referend the city council's decision, well, your recommendation to approve and the city council's ultimate decision to approve the ordinance. The resolution is not up for referendum, just the ordinance, and specifically the development agreement for the Meadows project, the zone change for the Meadows project, and
Development agreement.
the specific plan for the Meadows project. So those 3 things are going to be up on May 8th for the voters to decide. And it's a little confusing because a yes vote on the issue of the referendum, but a yes vote will uphold the city council's decision, and a no vote will overturn the city council's decision.
A no vote on the referendum is really a yes?
Yeah,
It's not confusing.
yeah.
And it's called Prop 13, by the way.
Yeah.
Right.
but the general plan amendment is not at issue.
The general plan has taken effect, so it's currently designated general plan
Low density.
low density residential, and it's right now still institutional because the ordinance hasn't taken effect.
So the lot line adjustment and the general plan amendment are final.
and the CEQA certification.
Right.
There's a certified EIR for this project.
And the time limit to appeal those under writ of mandamus is passed.
has passed.
Okay.
But how could they have applied for low-density housing on an institutionally zoned project or parcel?
So they've applied, but we haven't processed the application yet. You mean, how is NUI applied?
Yes.
Right. So I think NUI submitted applications, but
But we couldn't accept it because of the referendum. Because of the referendum.
right, we can't, we accepted it, but we just can't process it and bring it before before hearing. So you will never see it until this referendum is
But
complete.
there's no zoning.
There's no, that's what I'm saying, is how could they have even put in an application? Or I guess anybody can put in an application
Right.
that's miszoned. The
Right.
application they put in is
Right.
miszoned because it's currently institutional.
Right, right. So,
Yeah, so a new application would have to change that zoning to comply with the low-density residential general plan designation that was approved. So to comply with low-density residential is R1 zoning.
I'm sorry, maybe I wasn't clear on this point, but when there's a conflict between the general plan and the zoning, the general plan controls. So what they've submitted to us is a complete application because they have everything they need for the application, but we won't bring it before this body until the issue of whether or not that site is institutionally zoned or low-density residential has been resolved. Because if, for example, the referendum is successful, the city council is going to be required to bring consistency, and this body is going to be required to bring consistency to the general plan and the zoning code mismatch. So that will need to be rezoned. Rezoned to what? It's not clear. But in any case, they submitted an application, and because they've submitted that application, whatever the general plan designation is, that's what's going to control, even if there's a mismatch between the zoning and
So
the general plan.
because there's been CEQA clearance for the general plan amendment, changing the zone from institutional to residential wouldn't take an EIR, right? It would be,
Just
I don't know, is the neg deck or
achieving
tiered or?
Just achieving consistency
Yeah.
with the underlying general.
Be just a regulatory action that
So I-
is,
But two ways to achieve that, right? Either amend the general plan
Back to institutional.
back to institutional.
But wouldn't that require an EIR then?
so I'm like afraid to get into discussion because it's not properly agendized for
Fair enough.
discussion.
Fair enough, fair enough.
I have a lot of questions.
Yeah, if
Which-
you'd like, we could agendize this for a future discussion. We can discuss it if you'd like.
Net is nothing happens until the election, so maybe,
Yeah, nothing happens until this issue is resolved, so.
Yeah, I would rather use our time on that list.
Yep.
And then let's have the voters vote and we'll deal with it afterwards.
Kimosabe?
For 1 month.
Short timers. Thank you very much.
That concludes my report.
All right, then I guess if there's nothing else, I will conclude this meeting until March 2nd.